it's that mask of like, I'm good, I'm fine, because that's kind of like the masculine way of approaching it. I did that for about 3 years, probably like masking it in the clothes that I bought and the car that I drove and the business that I was trying to build, and the confidence that I might have come across with in that sort of friendship circle. But underneath all of that were like nights where I cry myself to sleep. There was nights where I would like just be extremely emotional. There's a great quote I think that summarizes it, which says, when you struggle with your mental health, it's tiring, but when you struggle with your mental health and you pretend that you're okay, it's completely exhausting. And I think that pretending was something that I thought was the way of being resilient, but in reality it wasn't. Like, me and you talk a lot about this now, but I thought I was being resilient by keeping it to myself and trying to crack on and juggle everything else. But then I found myself at 21 in pretty much the same situation as my dad. And I'm like, now what? Like, I can't keep running away from this. I need something different.
Paul, how are things?
Doing well, mate. Doing well. I was saying it's been a while since we've actually had a chat, so I'm looking forward to this.
No, me too. It's long overdue, but I'm confident that will make for an excellent conversation rather than it just being one that's long overdue. So question number one is, what is your current mission? Because I'm not going to ask you who you are and what you do, because I feel there's more going on than that. What is your mission right now?
It's one that I've been thinking about for a while, to be honest, Fergus. So main focus for me is an organisation called Everymind At Work, which I started, and our core mission is to help employees feel safe to talk about mental health. So we focus very much on stigma in the workplace, and work with different organisations on that in particular, and just creating those sort of safer environments where people can talk openly about mental health. Personal mission, I think, I've been reflecting on this for a while. I think it's to continue championing, mental health awareness inside and outside of the workplace, but also to encourage more champions. So as we'll get into it today, by me sharing my story, can I encourage more people to share theirs and increase that vulnerability, increase those conversations? So yeah, just keep championing in the work that I do.
I'm sure that's more concise than it was a couple of years ago when you first started the business.
Potentially, yes.
So let's rewind, because there's obviously a reason that you're doing these things, and we actually first connected through that buzzword storytelling, in that we connected through me finding your story online, and at the point whilst I was sharing mine for the first time. So 2009, how did things change for you that ultimately started this journey?
Yeah, so if we go back to 2009, I always kind of explain it as, up into that point, mental illness wasn't a concept really that I paid much attention to, because, I was never taught about it. I wasn't educated on it. I always kind of say to people that my idea of mental illness back all the way in before 2009 was very much straitjackets, padded cells, personalities that acted a certain way. And it sounds terrible now, but that was just because there was no education, no understanding of it. So with that being what I always saw it to be, I never believed that it would impact me. But, as you say, in 2009, it did impact me. Mental illness impacted me through my dad. And, his very short spell of depression. And what I mean by that was, my dad was incredible man, like full-time engineer by trade. He was a qualified physiotherapist, so sports therapist. Remember, like, the spare room in the bedroom was like his physio room. So like evenings and weekends, we'd have people come round, and like, my dad would be their physio. His want to become a physio come from like his love of running. He was an incredible runner. I know you will appreciate this. Some of your listeners will appreciate this. His 5K time, I think, was about 15 minutes 15. So yeah, very good runner. For a 1500 meter runner. Like, so very obsessed with physical health and running and everything else, and was also like not shy of meditating and like trying all the stuff that wasn't very cool back then. So was for someone who was very little warning signs of him ever dealing with mental health challenges until he broke down very quickly. Behaviors changed, telling us that he was struggling. We took him to the doctors when that happened, and he was prescribed antidepressants, signed off from work, diagnosed with depression. And I'm sure we'll go into the story a lot deeper, but what followed from then was a 6-month period where we didn't really know what to do as a family. There was ups, there was downs. There was a attempted suicide very quickly. After that initial diagnosis, there was 4 months out of 6 months of that time spent in a mental health unit. My dad was sectioned. So again, visiting my dad every single day in that unit. And, sadly, as we kind of, shared, one of the core reasons, and the core reason that I do the work that I do is because we did lose my dad. And, we lost him to suicide when I was 18 and he was 45. So, very difficult time. Suicide grief is a horrible grief. Still gets me now. They often say it's grief with the volume turned up, but I then went through my own battles and struggled to talk about it. But yeah, I'm very vocal about it now, similar to you, Fergus. But I'm sure in both of our own journeys, we've had to kind of deal with it and manage it in our own ways before we felt comfortable to share it like we do now. But yeah, that's the main driver. The key reason why I do the work that I do. It's to keep my dad's story going on and help others through his story as well.
As always, enormous thank you. Being honest with us, it's never an easy thing to do. I can speak from experience, but it's something that obviously very, very sorry to hear, which I'm sure you've heard a million times in your life, but for those listening, it's not an easy thing to talk about. But you spoke about how you reacted, how you process things, and every person's experience will be different, obviously. But you went quite masculine by definition, didn't you, in terms of how you reacted? It was almost I don't want to say hiding, but almost a lack of confrontation to the reality of how you felt. So do you want to just talk us through how you reacted in the first couple of months, the first couple of years after that experience? Because I know it's a core element of why you talk about the way why you talk about the things that you do now and the way that you do.
Yeah, I look back at kind of what I was taught. I'm a dad now, right? I've got 3 boys, and I'm always thinking about the role modeling, the education that you can provide to your children. And, my dad was an incredible man. But at the same time, I don't think I ever saw him really cry until that period that he was struggling. And then I reflect on my granddad, born in 1925, passed away when he was 95 years old. Again, I only saw my granddad cry in the last 3 months of his life. So I think I was definitely taught a very masculine way of approaching emotions and feelings. My dad was a sensitive guy. He wasn't like a really like closed off individual, but there was parts of him that I always had my granddad in him, if that makes sense. And I saw that. So, when I lost my dad, I remember it vividly, like, because of the way of him dying and, us then being told the news. I remember crying my eyes out, like, for the first time, like just as you would, like when you've just been told that, your dad has taken his own life, he's died. I remember crying, and then I was at my nan and granddad's house, but then I automatically went into like anger. So I remember like punching the kitchen counter, right? Because, you're surrounded by your mum's crying, your brother's crying. I struggled to handle all of that, like with everyone being so emotional. And then it's a funny thing with grief, because then a few hours later, me and my brother are picking up fish and chips, like, and trying to eat and crack on with life, right? Because you need to eat, you need to carry on with life. The next morning, me and mum are walking the dog. People are like, "Hey, morning." And no one's got an idea that you've just experienced what you've experienced. And I think that then carried on. I went to a nightclub about 6-7 days after my dad's suicide. A lot of my friends questioned why, but for me, it was about like, I'm fine, I'm going out, I want to crack on, back to work as soon as I could. And yeah, it's that mask, right? It's that mask of like, I'm good, I'm fine, because that's kind of like the masculine way of approaching it. But I think that definitely, I did that for about 3 years. Probably like masking it in the clothes that I bought and the car that I drove and the business that I was trying to build, and, the confidence that I might have come across with in that sort of friendship circle. But underneath all of that were like nights where I cry myself to sleep. There was nights where I would like just be extremely emotional. So it's a funny one, right? How like we all wear that mask. But there's a great quote, I think, that summarizes it, which says, when you struggle with your mental health, it's tiring. But when you struggle with your mental health and you pretend that you're okay, it's completely exhausting. And I think that pretending was something that I thought was the way of being resilient. But in reality, it wasn't. Like, me and you talk a lot about this now, but I thought I was being resilient by keeping it to myself and trying to crack on and juggle everything else. But then I found myself at 21 in pretty much the same situation as my dad. And I'm like, now what? Like, I can't keep running away from this. I need something different. So, that was the first time that I actually went to see a therapist again, and then started to work through a lot of that stuff. But yeah, the mask was something that I definitely wore for a long time.
There's a difference between being stoical and resilient and avoiding reality, avoiding confronting the truth, isn't there? And one thing I just want to touch on, because it's something I kind of often wrestle with my own ambitions. Ambition was kind of what led me to the slippery slope I found myself in, pretending that I was okay with my mental health, which I can confirm was exhausting back in 2014 to 2016. So you were building a business. You were effectively building a business. You built a successful business in that period of time, and you said it was about the clubs you were going to, the cars you were driving. Ambition is a good thing in my mind, and you managed to succeed conventionally, traditionally, and fulfill your ambition during such a challenging period of time. But now, with the knowledge that you have and the ambitions you have as a business owner in a completely different sector, what elements of that drive, of that entrepreneurial spirit, of that business building, of that ambition do you think were healthy and which were actually coping mechanisms for something that wasn't being confronted? Because I know there's a lot of people out there that will put themselves in the bin for their ambition when there's actually some things in the background that they might need to tackle head on.
Such a good question. I've been thinking about this a lot, and this probably is going to go deep, right? But I was obsessed with self-improvement, like so obsessed with self-improvement. So if there wasn't a minute where I was improving, I'm failing, right? And my idea of acceptance was giving in, not being, again, masculine, not being ambitious. So what I mean by that is if I was like, I've had a bad day today, but that's fine. That didn't sit well with me because that was almost like I should be doing more. And then it's come from therapy actually over the last few years. You know, why was that? The reason why I'm very obsessed with self-improvement is the biggest fear I have is I'll end up like my dad, right? There's a lot of research that's just been released actually, and it made sense to me as soon as I saw it that those bereaved by suicide are more likely to die by suicide as well. So there's a lot of support around postvention. As soon as someone's bereaved by suicide, providing that support to those bereaved because they're more at risk of having mental health challenges, more at risk of taking their own life. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, that makes sense, because as soon as it happened, it's always been my fear. I'll end up like him. And you know, there was times where I'd go to the doctors and I'd be like, I feel tired. I'm sleeping a lot, but I still feel tired. And my doctor was like, I feel like you might have depression. No. It's like I was running away from that because now I'm like mirroring to my dad, and that's like feeding the fear that I'm going to end up like him. So I've definitely worked for a lot of that fear. It still is one of my biggest fears, but with that came, like this, as you say, drive to consistently improve and be good and be 100% all of the time. If you're not, then you're failing, and that becomes a very exhausting place to be. So I would say the difference now is that I think it's really good to have ambition. You know, it's really good to have purpose. Like I'm very fortunate that, you know, I love entrepreneurship and I love mental health, if however strange that sounds, right? So it's the business that I've created is a real good combination of both. I can grow a business, I can talk about the entrepreneurship side of it, but at the same time, I'm delivering talks and you know, trying to impact and help people in the same way. So I'm very, very lucky in that instance. But one thing I have learned massively to find that balance is to accept the days that I'm not 100%, to not always be pushing myself to like the limit, and knowing that that's okay. But it's constantly like the juggle that I have. It, you know, am I doing enough to grow? Am I accepting enough? So again, we could probably go deeper into it, but I'm still trying to find that balance myself. But a big part of it is for me wanting to do this for my own self in comparison to the last business was for me to do it for other people. So it was almost like there's a great concept called social perfectionism. Once everyone knows that I've got the 5-bed house, the car, the business, I'm smiling, I'm out in the club, I'm happy, no one's going to ask me how I'm feeling, because I don't want anyone to ask me how I'm feeling, because I'm not feeling good. Whereas now it's different. Like I'm more content and fulfilled and able to be vulnerable. So in other words, I'm doing this not for that external validation and external reason. There's always still parts of that, but I'm doing it because I think this is the right thing to do.
Is your attitude towards money and finances completely different given those perspectives then?
Massively, yeah. And I learned a lot from this, again, my dad and my granddad. My dad and granddad were the tightest men that you'll ever meet in your life, right?
I live in Scotland. There's a fair few up here. Don't you
Yeah,
worry.
to be honest with you, I'm sure they could compete. But like the stories of my granddad that would make so many people laugh. Like my poor nan, they'd go out for to the supermarket, and they'd go to the little cheap cafe there, and she wanted prawns on her jacket potato, but he wouldn't give them to her because they're 20p extra, right? She'd have to deal with beans and no cheese because cheese was an extra cost as well. So my mum used to say when she used to take my nan out, she'd treat her to the prawns, right? So my granddad was very much like that. He was just like, no, 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 very like scarcity mindset. Then that passed down to my dad. My dad wasn't wealthy in any way, but he was a guy who would he always, one of the biggest problems that I had is my dad saved for an early retirement at 50, took his own life at 45, right? So, as soon as that happened, my dad was, as I say, very, very scarce with money. But during that 6-month period when he was really, really struggling with his mental health, his whole spending of money was massively different. I'm sure you know this, but like giving away possessions, don't worry about this, I'll pay for this, I'll pay for that, which is totally against his character of what he was. And then on reflection, my granddad was the same, right? Last 6 months to a year of my granddad, I was next to Kim. My brother's next to Kim, but my brother, he's disabled now. So I took a lot of, having to like pay for my granddad's bills and like shopping and all stuff like that. And I'll never forget there was times where he was like, go to the shop and buy the boys some presents. And I come back, I was like, I just spent 20 quid on them, granddad. Is that all right? It's like, why do you just spend £20? Go and spend hundreds on them, right? So again, completely different to what he was like at the end of his life. So I've learned so much from both of that they were more giving with money when they were in this like part near the end of their life, right? So I'm definitely someone who doesn't worry about money as much as I used to. But I'm also someone who is a little bit more conscious of spending it on the right things and saving it as well. So yeah, I've learned loads about money. I still, to be honest with you, I still have a lot more work to do with it. It's like, it's more about the behaviors and the habits that I think we've developed from our own parents that I'm still working on. But yeah, my drive for money is not what it used to be.
I've learned a lot about that topic in the past couple of weeks from 2 podcast guests. One's already out, Nick Majuli, and Daniel Crosby's coming out very soon. And it's exactly as you've said, the behaviours and patterns around why we spend in the way that we do is something I'm more conscious of now, because it makes the connection between money, happiness, fulfillment clearer, which means you're one step closer to actually living a happier, more fulfilled life. So that's why I wanted to touch on that, because it's something at the forefront of mind at the moment as well.
Just quickly on that as well, because I think it's a really important point. Like, one of the key things that I learned was, with the last business and the last work that I was doing, and because I was in such a lower state, my expenses were like ridiculously high. There's a great book called The Richest Man in Babylon. Don't know if you've ever read that. It's a strange book, but like it just makes so much sense. And it's like, it talks about like the lean purse, and it's essentially the concept of the more money we make, the more money we spend, right? So I was like accumulating more money, more income, and then I was just spending more and more. So I was just getting myself into debt, more and more debt, right? So, when I found myself into debt, it wasn't that I wasn't earning enough money. I was just spending way more than I had. So the difference now is like my expenses are a lot lower. We live in like a 4-bed now. I just had it extended, but my mortgage is quite low. Again, it's going up very soon.
In the southeast, I think.
Yeah, it's going up soon. But so again, that's why I then went all in on the mental health stuff, because it was like, okay, I haven't got to make this huge amount anymore. I can make a lot less, and then be more fulfilled. So I think there's something there that I speak to so many people. We work with lots of companies in different sectors, but you're in that trap. Right? You can't leave your job anymore because it's your family are expecting you to earn this amount, and your bonus will get you this amount. And if you leave, you're now at zero and you can't afford the life that you've created for yourself. So I think, again, it comes back to like ego and stripping everything back. I think we need to live within our means a little bit more.
Lifestyle creep's the phrase that I've heard used a lot recently, whereby if you can actually invest or put away X amount of whatever the next stage on the ladder is, then you'll be much better off than if you actually just see it as a relative ladder where every time you earn more, you live within the same discrepancy of what's left at the end of the month. Because all of a sudden, as you said, if you decide you're in your mid-40s, you're working at an investment bank, and you all of a sudden couldn't be earning £500,000 a year, you've got no choice but to stay there or to declare yourself bankrupt, if we're gonna be flippant about the example. But it's a case of, I think it's being more aware of what makes you tick as soon as you can, and thinking about what's important to you as mindfully as you can on a day-by-day, week-by-week basis, because it means that you can potentially avoid the trap sooner rather than later if you decide that what you're doing isn't what is actually fulfilling you. Because I think happiness is more tied in with fulfillment than it is anything else, personally.
Yeah, 100%.
So, how did you actually confront reality, confront the feelings of your dad's passing? Because there was a 3-year period where you've spoken about how it was almost disguised through other things, through other pursuits, other ambitions. But when did you come to terms with the emotions and actually start to move forwards processing it?
Yeah, so catalyst for me was a lady called Anne. I remember I went to therapy on the GP about a few months after my dad. I think it was that time where I went in, I was like, I feel tired. And he was like, you got depression? And I was like, no, I haven't. And then he tried prescribing me antidepressants, which again, I didn't want. But then he gave me his due. He walked out of his room, like in the doctor's surgery, went up to the receptionist. I don't think they were very appreciative of it. And he was like, this guy needs therapy as quickly as you possibly can, right? On reflection, that was probably a bit embarrassing, right? But he did it in like more of a quiet way. But I went to see like a GP therapist, and to be honest with you, nothing against them, it just didn't really help. So I tried it in the past, but yeah, I went to see this lady called Anne, and she was more of a holistic therapist. And to be honest with you, she also offered, like, it sounds very strange when I tell this story, but she also offers massage, right? So she's more of like go there for like a relaxing massage. It's like, but the way she was described to me was she knows more about you than you know about yourself. And I was like, quite interesting. So even if I think back to then, even though I was very unaware of, like, I was very low on self-awareness, I was still drawn to someone who probably knew more about me than I knew about myself. So I was looking for something, right? And yeah, it wasn't the first session. I used to just go there and go, I've got really sore, my back hurts, just come in for the massage, back hurts, come in for the massage. And then I think on the third session, she was like, Paul, why are you coming here? I was just like, well, my back. And then she said, no, honestly, like, tell me, why are you really coming here? And like, that was it. Like, I just like burst into tears. I said, like, my dad killed himself. I don't know what to do. And, that was, for me, was the catalyst, because now I have one person that has seen me cry, one person that I've been vulnerable to. And you know what it's like. It's a horrible feeling, actually. It's like, I feel very like vulnerable and like shameful and all of that. But, again, she was great, and she made me feel comfortable with it. And then I'd kept going back. And again, Anne will always say this with me or anyone else that she's helped. It was us that did the work, but she just guided us through a lot of that. And what she really helped me understand was my dad more, who he was and the reasons for him sadly ending his own life. And again, she helped me with self-awareness of, why am I drinking like that? Why am I going out like that? Why am I responding to my friends in that way? So there was a real, every week process of going to see her, working through a lot of it. What Anne did really well as well, and this probably, I said my obsession with self-improvement wasn't good. Back then it probably was good. Here's a book, like, go and read this, Eckhart Tolle, New Earth. Here's another book, go and watch this YouTube video. And I was diving into a lot of this stuff in my own time as well. It wasn't just the therapy. It was like, I wanted to feel better. So yeah, that was the catalyst for me. But I tell this a lot because, again, I'm sure you can relate to this. People see this as me being an open book on socials or like podcasts like this. And they're like, I want to be more open. And what I have to remind people of, and what I remind myself of, is I went and saw Anne, and I was going to see her every single week for about 3 years before I told my best friend that I was even going to therapy. So that's a huge amount of time when I'm going to therapy, but still being very secretive about it, and not even feeling confident pulling my best friend aside and saying, I've been going to therapy. So again, a lot of the stuff that I like to talk about now is like that shame that we carry, because I definitely felt a lot of shame for a long time. So it's about, it took me such a huge amount of time to be where I'm at, and I'm still a work in progress, but I think having to deal with that shame and dealing with the trauma head on and not avoiding it was definitely the key thing for me.
It's fascinating that the element of massage was what drew you in, because it's so funny to me that we're all so similar as men, because when you said that, my first thought was that's exactly why I was drawn to Movember, because it wasn't mental health, it was mustache. It wasn't therapy, it was massage. It's just the entry points are so similar, but that's good in a way, because it means that we have a way of getting to a solution, but we create more of our own obstruction. So I think that's why finding solutions that aren't necessarily as emotive conventionally, so just going to therapy might not be the solution, but going to therapy that's on a walk or on a round of golf might be more effective for men, because I had Adam Lane Smith on who spoke about vasopressin, which is sort of the chemical component of our brains that means that as men we bond more when we are working through things together. And that's why, in terms of processing emotion, it's just fascinating to me that you had massage as your disguise, I had the mustache as my disguise, and they both helped us come out the other side with, as you said, the open book mentality that comes from a lot of work over the years. But with that, the process of writing Man Up, Man Down, was that a therapeutic one, or was it traumatic in some way, because you had to dig back into childhood memories and real deep reflections on your experience following your dad? And I can imagine there were some bumps in the road along the way.
Yeah, I mean, that come about, I'd say it was very early on in my journey of sharing it more publicly. And I never wanted to write a book like that. I always wanted it to be more self-help focused. So more like how to deal with suicide bereavement, and then like you weaving my story into that, because it's very rare that I'll read a book that's someone's story. So I was always wanting to kind of write a book that was more self-help focused. But the publishing company at that time was, they had a series that was more about like inspirational stories, and they wanted it to be focused on like the whole story. So that meant that, you had to go a lot deeper. So like you had to write a lot about the finer details of, his suicide and, the feelings that came with that, and then the process after it. And the challenges that I had was when there was more stuff around like my mum, more stuff around like my brother, and he had an accident, and my mum had her own sort of challenges along the way, and that was harder for me because my dad's not here to tell me whether he appreciates me telling his story or not, right? I'm sure he would. I'm sure he's fine with it, right? But my mum and my brother are, and my stuff about me and my wife and us, we struggled with our second child and things like that. That stuff was harder. But there was a part of me that, like, when I did put it out there, it was like the vulnerability was more exposed, and the kind of communication back and people seeing it definitely helped me to be more vulnerable after that period. But yeah, long story short, I mean, the book now, I don't think they're printing it anymore. It kind of sold out, and they approached me and said, do you want to do another version of it? And I was like, yeah. So we was in the process of writing a new book called Searching for Why. So very specific to suicide bereavement. Like when you searching for why, everyone who's lost someone to suicide will understand that title.
It was the exact premise of Our Silent Emergency, the documentary with Roman Kemp. That was the exact premise. It was Rome's exploration of why.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the most like, it's the most exhausting part of suicide grief is like when you're trying to find that reason of why. And it was going to be more self-help focused with some of the story weaved in, but I pulled it in the end because I was like, I don't have the time. And to be honest with you, I think there was a part of me, now you've asked that question, there's a part of me that doesn't want to dive too deep into it again at this current stage in my life, if that makes sense. So yeah, no, it was definitely a therapeutic process. I used to write a lot during the periods of me not being able to talk to my friends or anyone else. I used to write a lot of stuff down. So it was kind of like an evolution from that. But it was very, very hard, very tough to write it is one thing, but then to get it out there and know that my father-in-law saw bits and my mother-in-law read it and my mum read it and friends have read it. That definitely exposed me a bit more than some of the other stuff that I've done. But I think that was a good thing in the end, because now I can carry on sort of being a bit more authentically myself as well.
All out on the table as well, which means that you don't really have an opportunity to claw it back, which is, in my mind, a good thing long term, because it forces you to actually confront these things in reality and almost disarm them in a way. Because if people know the vulnerabilities you're fearful of exposing, then there's nothing to fear anymore in that sense. But whilst, yes, there might be, oh, how am I going to be judged? How are people going to experience this? I don't know anyone that's told their story about this sort of thing, being ridiculed, being told they're ridiculous these days. I don't know that happening. So I only see value in lessons like that. Whilst it might be intimidating, whilst it might be really fear-inducing, and you don't know who's reading what, you don't know who's saying what, ultimately putting it all out on the table is the most raw and effective and direct way of confronting all the things that you're afraid to actually expose to the world.
Yeah, makes sense. I've got a question for you, if you don't mind, Fergus, because it's something that's been
Go on.
racking my brain, and it's on that topic. So when people hear me speak, they say it's extremely vulnerable. Like, your vulnerability is like, it shines through in like that webinar that you delivered. Now, you'll relate to this. That's not me being that vulnerable anymore, right? It's the, I don't like to say the presenter version of Paul, but like I've done that story. I tell that story time and time and time again, right? I've been telling that for like 5-6 years, over and over and over again. They'll change, they'll differ, but like you're telling it. So it makes me think that there's so much more to me that I still need to be vulnerable with, right? Because in other words, we spoke about this. It's like the degrees of vulnerability. To some people, that's vulnerable. Sharing your story to like an audience of people. To me and you now, that's not as vulnerable as it would have been, like, let's say 10, 15 years ago, right? For us. But then there's probably so much to me that I'm avoiding that I don't feel comfortable telling my wife, that I don't feel comfortable telling my therapist still. Does that make sense? It's like
it does.
I'm
It does.
to...
It creates a veil to hide behind, because you're presenting yourself as vulnerable when in reality you're actually quite comfortable with it.
Yeah.
The caveat I'll add there is, we spoke about this before we started recording, is I feel most vulnerable and exposed, and it all comes back and takes me out of presenter mode, or rehearsed mode, shall we say, where I have other people share their experiences with me against the background of my own, because all of a sudden I'm disarmed through the comfort of talking about these things and having to process somebody else's. I've had a few recently where, honestly, for days afterwards, I was really struggling. I was considering messaging the company to ask for the person's address so I could just go and check if they're okay and speak to them and things like that. And it's really difficult sometimes to detach yourself from those conversations. But practically speaking, I am aware of the fact that I don't necessarily confront my own vulnerabilities as head on as I have done previously, because I've got, not complacent, but I've done enough of the reps to have the confidence that I'll be able to sort of swat them away when they come charging at me. But the ultra endurance stuff for me is my constant putting myself in an uncomfortable position where I have to tackle internally what's going on in the background. Because when I'm sleep deprived, when I'm exhausted, when I want to go home and just sit on the sofa with Erin, you've got no choice but to confront your own vulnerabilities. And that's why that stuff's become so valuable for me. But I'm conscious that I don't want to get caught into this tornado of searching for the next layer down of vulnerability, because that could become quite almost damaging, masochistic in some ways. And I want to understand that the ebbs and flows of day-to-day life, the challenges that I present as businesses grow, as social profile grows, all these things that I need to be aware of, is there's only so much vulnerability and self-improvement considerations I can take on at once. So the calibration for me is the training and the events. But I don't want to get caught into the trap of constantly pushing that further and further and further, because it might get to the point where I just feel a bit lost and meaningless. Because the process of searching for these vulnerabilities intrinsically is valuable in and of itself. So I don't want to just make the end goal, what's the answer? Because it's like you, when you were talking about that constant self-improvement, that was the trap that I fell into when I was younger, and it nearly killed me. So whilst that's still a huge part of my personality now and a huge part of what I talk about on here, I'm much more measured in when I'm upping the dosage or reducing the dosage of that intensity, because I know that you can't have your foot to the floor. You can't be at 7,000 revs the whole time. Sometimes you need to be at 0. Sometimes you can sit at 2.5 for ages, and it's just something that it's more balanced. It's more holistic. So whilst I acknowledge I'm ambitious, I have a layer of intensity that's probably a bit difficult to deal with at some points. Sorry, Erin, and friends and family. It does mean that I'm higher risk and therefore need to confront the vulnerabilities that you've highlighted. Otherwise, I could very easily tailspin quite quickly, to stick with my car analogy. But for those that don't know, for context on that, it's not something I talk about too much on social. It's more a behind-the-scenes element of the modern mind. I do about 5 to 10 webinars or in-person talks a month, and that's a huge part of what I do and a huge part of the value that I gain from talking about this stuff. But I don't really want to share all of those things as much because they're really intense, demanding days, and I come away from some feeling absolutely drained because, like we said before we started talking, the personal reflections we've done over and over and over and over and over and over for years, which means that you become desensitized to them, but you're not desensitized to other people's. So that's really what knocks me back whenever I have conversations or have somebody very kindly and openly and powerfully, and I'm grateful that they do, share their experiences with me or their current challenges with me. The other challenge is we don't necessarily have the qualification there and then to provide them with solutions, which as a human is difficult because you want to provide and help, but all you can do is signpost, which doesn't give you total confidence that you've done all you can, even though essentially you have. So short answer to the question is I find exposing myself to my own vulnerability through ultra endurance is my solution to keep on top of it. But I'm also conscious that I don't want to get caught in that downward spiral of what's the bottom of this pit, because that could be quite a negative headspace to be in. But that self-improvement is good because it means that I can never let myself get too far away from the person that I truly am, which is a very poetic way to round off my answer.
No, it's so true. It's like you say, I think it's just consistent awareness and understanding. It's like I'm always learning more about myself, but that just comes from the awareness, the want to learn more. So yeah, no, it's interesting. We've been speaking a little bit about it as a team, and I've spoke to a couple of other speakers about it, and it's just like everyone's vulnerability is very different,
which is good because it means that we've all got our own unique experience and our own lenses to look at things through, which means the more that we share them, the more insight other people can gain from them. So with that in mind, you've already mentioned it, and we're rewinding a little bit from where we are on the timeline as such, but not in any way a comparison, but when you became a father, how did you reflect on your experience with your dad to determine the dad that you wanted to be?
Very good question. So I've got 3 boys. I've got Freddie, who's my stepson. So I met Freddie when he was 18 months old, and he's now 13, right? So relationship with Freddie is he's a 13-year-old. We can have open conversations. He knows a lot about my dad, knows a lot about the work that we've done, or I do, and incredible boy. Special boy. Got a good relationship with his dad. Probably like co-parenting 2022, 2023. Like we're going on holiday next year all together, right? So his dad's wife cuts my Amy's hair, my wife's hair. So we all getting really well. So it's always about putting him first. So we've got Freddie, and then I've got Teddy, who's 6. Very much conversations still evolve around Minecraft and stuff like that currently. And then very difficult decision. Just had a third boy. And it's always difficult when you've named the first 2, Freddie and Teddy. Like, what do you name the third son? But we have Ralphie. So Ralphie is 5 months old. So really, really like still in that newborn stage. Hence the sleep deprivation and just like the difficulties of the newborn. Now I struggled a lot with, firstly, I look back on like becoming a stepdad, right? And I was young. I was 21 when I met Amy. And I remember like a comment that I made after my dad. I was like, I'm going to become a young dad. Like, I only ever said it, but I said that to someone. I think it was an ex-girlfriend at the time, actually. And so then when I met Amy, like Amy was back then, like a 20, 21-year-old like guy with a huge ego, right, going out like drinking with the guys. It was like, you know, Amy was someone who had Freddie. She was 19 when she had Freddie, and you know, we were working together in this bar. But I think looking back on it, what Amy had that I needed at that time was maturity and stability. She had her own place. She was a mum, whereas I was just like this loose cannon, just trying to figure out what was going on in my head. So with Freddie, it was like there was definitely like periods where, you know, I was invested. Then I would be like, is this the right thing to do? And I would kind of like not be invested. And I look back on that and I do regret that. You know, Amy was very patient with that. But now, like, yeah, completely all in with him. He's an incredible boy. Like I say, I was there since he was 18 months. He calls me dad, and we've really got a close relationship. You know, but with Teddy, when Teddy was born, we struggled with him. My wife had a few miscarriages, and you know, we did struggle to have him. And then when he came, there was a few moments where I dealt with a lot of the stuff. I was going to see Anne, and I was in a better place, but I was still struggling with some stuff. And I remember once, probably was the lack of sleep, I went to feed him in his cot. So he was in a separate bed at the time, so he must have been about 6-7 months. Went to feed him in his cot. And I remember like getting so angry at my dad. I remember like just thinking to myself, how could you have left us? Like, you know, I'm looking at like my son in his eyes, and I'm thinking to myself, how could you leave like me and my brother, right? And I remember I got back into bed, and I looked at the stars. I could see them out the window, and I was just like, I was quite angry back then. And that was like, you know what, 8 years after he died. So there was lots of that. There was lots of, you know, the grief came flooding back when I became a dad. But I kind of worked all through that, and Amy really helped me with that. She was like, Paul, you know, you was 18, your brother was 20 when it happened. It's completely different than like a newborn and, you know, young kids. And again, you know, your dad wasn't very well, so it definitely helped. But I'm always very conscious of how I parent them. But very, very long answer. But one of the key things that I'm trying to do as a dad, which is I've learned it a lot from my dad and my mum, is to not be too concerned about like the wisdom and the lessons that I give them verbally, but more about like the wisdom and the lessons that I give to them by them role modeling who I am as an individual. So I remember there was times with my dad where he'd sit me down and he'd walk me through like the Maslow hierarchy of needs and stuff. And I remember just like, it was nice, right? But it wasn't like, it sticks with me, but I don't remember it, right? What I remember is my dad going for those runs. I remember my dad training hard and like working in those evenings and being a very caring guy. Like no one had a bad word to say about my dad. The way he treated people, same as my mum. Like, the way my mum was so caring to me and my brother, very compassionate, very empathetic. You know, would kind of do whatever she could for people. Like I've role modeled that, I feel. So with my boys, I feel guilty when I go for my runs. Like you'll experience this, Fergus. Like, you know, I love running. I love getting out there. I love focusing on myself. I love the business trips where I'm on my own. But you feel like a bad husband. You feel like a bad dad. But I consistently remind myself of like, they'll be okay. And if they can role model those behaviors, that's far better than me being a stay-at-home dad who's unhappy, unfulfilled, shouting at them every minute because I'm not happy. So I've definitely tried to do that a little bit more. And also just quickly on that, another thing that I've tried to do a lot better is it comes from a quote that I heard, which is when I was growing up, I didn't realize I was watching my parents grow up as well. And that really resonates with me because I remember like looking at my mum and dad, like they had all the answers. Like they were these like incredible human beings that knew everything about life and they would protect me and everything else. You know, my mum was 23 when she had me, you know, and you know, and she was young. And in your sort of 20s, end of 20s, early 30s, you're still learning. You're still like figuring out stuff. You're still dealing with all of your potential trauma that you've experienced. So what I've learned from that quote is not being afraid to go up to Freddie and say, I really apologize for shouting at you last night. You know, I just wasn't having a very good day. You know, I delivered a session and it was a little bit intense and there was a few things that come up about my dad that made it quite hard for me. It doesn't justify the fact of me shouting at you like that last night, but like, I do really apologize. And it comes back to that vulnerability. I think as parents, we feel like we can't do that. But again, in my experience, me being able to be like that with my kids, hopefully will help them be vulnerable later on as well. So, but I think parenting is the most rewarding, most challenging thing in the world, mate. It is just so, so hard for sure.
It seems like everybody's just making it up as we go
We
along,
are.
which
Figuring it
is
out.
the thing. Because as a child, you think, oh, adults, don't you? You think they've got all the answers. They are the Gandalfs of the real world. When in reality, no, everybody's just making it up, and we're figuring it out as we go. But it's amazing to hear that actions speak louder than words, ultimately, because I've had some sessions where I've been asked how people can be better parents, and I immediately panic because I'm like, well, I'm not a parent. I don't have the answers here. But the assumption I've made is we respond to what we see rather than what we hear as human beings more. So the answer I've always given is along the lines of, if you are willing to admit that you don't have it all together to your kids, they'll be more willing to present themselves when they don't feel that they've got it all together. Because healthy environments are one thing, but then actually taking that step forward, because we're also fearful of exposing ourselves, as we've already covered, it's action that brings that to life. And I think that only comes from doing the reps, doing the work, and actually tackling these things head on. So no, it's something that I think any parents listening can take away, is that, big cliche, but actions speak louder than words. And the environment that you can create in a household to cultivate healthy, open conversations is by having them, not just saying that they are okay to have, if that all makes sense. So to work into a bit more of a modern setting, Everymind at Work exists to tackle the challenges that we face in corporate culture and to provide solutions for the people within it. So before the business was created, what were the problems that you isolated in the corporate culture of the UK that you felt needed better served?
Yeah, so the initial concept for Everymind was our app. So our app was the first product that we went to market with. And this was before every man and a dog had an app. Just want to point that out, right? Not saying that I was like the innovator
You're ahead of the curve.
of the world, right? But there was, when I was doing my research, there was literally two in the UK, a company called Unmind that have gone on to do extremely well. And also a company called Thrive that were like, had a good partnership with the NHS. And you know, I'm sure there was other stuff bubbling in the background, but the idea came from the fact that, you know, very similar to you, as I started to be more vocal about my story on social media, and I used to do a lot of charity work and do talks in public, naturally, especially LinkedIn became a platform where I would get a message from a HR director, and they'd say, hey, seen this on LinkedIn, we're trying to do a talk for World Mental Health Day, can you come in and share? And, you know, being completely transparent with you, there was then we have X amount of money to give you for this. And I remember being at that time, you know, I was doing all the talks for free. I still do lots of talks for free, just to point out. But, you know, I was like, okay, so, you know, corporates in the right sense have money to spend on this, and they should be spending money on it. And if I can potentially get corporates to pay me to do the talks, then maybe that allows me then more opportunity to do talks for schools for free and charities for free, because then, you know, I'm not trying to sort of like, you know, monetize it in any way. You know, you mentioned about, you know, Julie in the interview that you've got. For me back then, it was like, let's grow an audience, and what happens. Like there was no like monetization behind it. So I started to do talks in corporates, and I remember like someone explained to me that like you're like a bomb that goes off in the workplace. In other words, I was like, is that a compliment or not? But what they were trying to say was, you're getting all of these people together for like a lunch and learn, back then they used to call it, and they probably still do. And it's the only way you get them into a mental health talk is like provide free lunch. And then you've got this guy standing there being, you know, vulnerable, talking about his dad and, you know, sharing quite openly. And then the feedback from it was, you know, even in that session, they highlighted that there was individuals that was struggling without them knowing. So someone might feel comfortable to say, could really resonate with this. You know, I lost a parent to suicide, or really resonate with this. You know, I've been on antidepressants for the last few years. And because of the silence in that kind of culture, no one had any idea what those individuals were going through. So, you know, that one talk started to encourage more conversations. But here was the downside to it. What happens next? You know, it was World Mental Health Day. It was like one day a year they'd get a talk in, and then I'm not going to come back because they've already used me. They'll try and find someone else next year. But, you know, how do you keep that momentum going? So the initial idea was the app. The app was going to be like 24/7 in your pocket whenever you need it. My dad was an engineer, so it was very much, okay, how would we have potentially got that support to my dad? Anonymous support on his phone in an app format. We went to market with that and, had some early success. But as soon as COVID hit, investments went ridiculous into mental health. So we just couldn't compete with the guys raising a huge amount of money on tech. But not only that, to caveat that, it didn't sit well with me. Here's what I mean by that is we were just seen as like this app as the one solution to every single person's, mental health in an organization. So you've got an organization of 1,000. It was, okay, but why are only 100 people using it? Now, in my eyes, it was like, okay, 100 people is a lot of people. Like if we're helping those 100 people, but to the corporates, they wanted to make sure everyone was using it. So, not all of them, but a lot of them were. So we then started to evolve. We started to add in like webinars and talks and workshops. And, we're starting to do a lot more now with champions and supporting champions, empowering, motivating them in organizations, because I've seen that to be such a really important sort of part of it. And we've kind of evolved in what we call like your mental well-being partner now. So we're like an extension to the HR team. Mental health well-being sits on HR's shoulders, but so does a lot of other stuff. We're your external partner that has the expertise that can provide you with the initiatives, the ongoing roadmap for the whole year. We can map it all out for you. We can give you that strategic advice as well as embedding the initiatives that you've invested. So that's a much better feel for me because we're having more of an impact. And yeah, it's grown incredibly. Like we're, just recently, last couple of weeks, mental health wellbeing partner for Wagamama's, the Co-op, Canon, Superdry, like construction companies like Waite, smaller companies. So I think we're approaching 100 that we work with on a year-to-year basis. And then there's others that we work with on a ad hoc basis. So yeah, it's always looking at new stuff that we can implement. But yeah, I'm glad that we kind of pivoted, because to be known as like the app as the only solution doesn't sit well with me in terms of like the impact that we're trying to create.
It's more tangible as well, isn't it? If you're empowering the organization, you're actually providing a continuous, a sort of flame that's constantly lit rather than a flame you can turn on and off. It just means that conversation is more at the forefront, which I think in this day and age is the only way anything like this can gain momentum. So fantastic to hear that the pivot has happened for a positive net result. Always the challenge of being in the tech business in an ever competitive world. So with that in mind, your personal challenges, because you're running a business, you have staff, you've moved into an industry that's highly competitive, you're serving people that are probably trying to negotiate on budget. They're probably trying to argue that you shouldn't be charging this much for this because we've already got an HR department that costs X. Why are we going to spend Y? What have been the big challenges for you personally along the way? Because I can imagine being away from the family with the time that needs committed is one thing, but I can also imagine that the day-to-day challenges of being a chief exec is something that's really made you think about the fulfillment that we discussed earlier on.
Yeah. It's hard. Like, previously the business that I had was very much me and freelancers, right? So I was very much a one-man band. Money that come in was money I could spend. This is very different. And it's a different type of business that I've ever grown. For me, it's about how do we make sure that our culture and our people are valued and appreciated. We're an organization that talks openly about businesses doing better in regards to proactively supporting and creating those cultures. So, it's something that I'm constantly thinking about. That's fine when you're at the number that we're at, which I believe is 15. But if that grows to 50, that becomes more of a challenge. How do you create that friendly culture, right? We all met up in London yesterday and we do like a scavenger hunt where like they had to get in two teams and do a series of photos and videos, and each photo and video had different points, and we would like judge them on it. And one of them was like who can do their best impression of Paul on a webinar, which is very embarrassing, but it's it's stuff like that. I feel like, and again I'm talking on behalf of the team, but our culture is good. Like it's very, very friendly. It's very like startup-y, but as that scales, that's definitely going to become more challenging. But one of the key things that I would say that I did well early on is identify what are my strengths and what are my weaknesses. My weaknesses is managing people. I'm not very good. I'm more of the ideas guy. I'm more of the creative guy. I would rather just, do the talks and, do a lot of the marketing stuff, but I'm not very operational. I'm not very good with managing people. So a guy I used to go to school with, James, he reached out to me when he saw the work that I was doing, and he come on board very early on, and we're like completely opposite in that. James is extremely operational, looks at things in quite a risk averse way, you know. So we've kind of got that balance, and he kind of managed people very early on. Um, and we've now just shifted into like a management structure. So we now have two senior managers as well, like in each of their teams. And then we've got James, and then we've got me. So that kind of gives me that sort of flexibility to do what I'm better at. So yeah, there's lots of challenges along the way. I just think it's about identifying your strengths and leaning in on that a little bit more. And also I talk about it a lot, being vulnerable as a leader. So if I do an update to the team, I'm not afraid of like saying, I'm not going to make all the right decisions here. I'm doing the best that I can with this. There might be some stuff that you disagree with us shifting this, organizational structure to this. But at the same time, this is something that I believe is the best for the business. And if you've got any questions, you can ask me. So, I'm trying to do better in regards to just being open and honest and vulnerable as well. But yeah, it's a challenge. It really, really is a challenge. And then, like you say, you've got the client side of it. But we've won some incredible deals when I didn't think that we'd win them because they've liked us to be personal. Right. And I think that's something that I've learned massively. I'm like, why do Wagamama's want to work with us? Why does Superdry want to work with us?
You know what I think it is? I think it's exactly as you said with being a parent. It's the senior leadership team is willing to be vulnerable. And I think that is the key ingredient for this in corporate culture from a personal point of view is you can do everything you want with the juniors, the grads, the middle management, the 35-year-olds, the those that have just become partners. But if the senior leadership team doesn't buy in, then the whole trickle-down effect doesn't work because if the junior staff is reporting to their line manager, who's then reporting to their higher-up, then at some point that chain is going to break where there is a person that's comfortable talking about this stuff and actually passing it on within a corporate setting. And that has to come downwards from the senior leadership team, even the board, depending on how hands-on they are. So I think from a personal observational point of view, the personality and the sort of personal draw of the brand and the business comes from the fact that the leadership team are willing to be vulnerable, whereas others might still feel that they need to be completely keeping everything together 100% intact at all times because that's how the business needs to be presented. When in reality, if you are experiencing the problems that you're trying to provide solutions for, you are better equipped to solve the problems from my perspective. So
yeah, and I think we've learned this, again, not naming names, but there was we've had a few clients that are like, not clients, we've had a few businesses that we haven't won because they're like, you're just a little bit too personal, right? We want a bit more like, science, or we want a bit more like mental health delivered in like a corporate way. Like everything that we do is evidence backed. It's, we've got head of psychology, Dr. Lauren Callahan. It's all signed off from a clinical point of view, but we lean in heavily on lived experience. So we've lost business because of that, but then we're gaining business because, as you've just said, if they buy into that human, like personal approach, then they're more drawn and attracted to us. But one of the other things that I was just quickly going to mention was, we've got a really interesting stat actually that based off what you've just shared. So on one of our sessions, we do anonymous polling, and we asked a question, which is, who would you speak to at mental health? Who would you speak to at work about your mental health? And we give them 6 options: HR, mental health first aiders, other, so like a EAP, colleagues, line manager, or no one. And naturally, I think for a long time in corporate world, we've gone to everyone will go to HR if they're struggling, right? But the data that we've got shows that 45% of people say no one at work. So that highlights that there's still stigma, like people don't feel comfortable talking to anyone at work about it. But then the second highest answers is line manager and colleagues, then line manager. So out of, I think it's like 5,000 people, I think that's answered that question, 93% of the answers is either no one, colleagues, or line manager. So as you've just shared there, especially with awareness increasing in society as well, if those managers aren't equipped to deal with it, if those colleagues aren't equipped to deal with it, but people are feeling comfortable sharing to them, then everyone needs some basic awareness or education on it now, I feel. So it's about, as you say, equipping the senior team, equipping the right people with just basic knowledge of it, because these conversations aren't going anywhere. They're only going to accelerate. So it's just making sure that everyone's equipped.
And to put my commercial silver-haired gentleman hat on, which I don't put on often because I probably haven't earned the right to put it on, if I'm honest. more fulfilled, happier employees will make you more money. And that's something that is worth considering, because based on the stats that you've given there, if HR are lower down the pecking order than the people that are just around the colleagues, then there's a fundamental flaw in the system that you've created in the hierarchy that exists, which is something that needs tackled. But I think I feel like I am, at the very least, we're about to go down a very deep, expansive, long-winded rabbit hole. So what I'm going to do is instead ask the question of, from a low-hanging fruit point of view, from your experience with corporates, with businesses, with the staff and everything that you've had fed back, what are the easiest things that corporates can change tomorrow to be able to have more of an impact on this?
So we're doing a lot of work on this now. It comes back to, like, our approach is very much about helping employees feel safe to talk about mental health. Like, that's our mission. So the reason why we do that is because the webinars that you might run, or I might run, or the app that you might launch, or the counseling service, or the tea and talk that you do in lunch break, none of that's going to be engaged with if people don't feel comfortable to access it, right? So what we always say is you've got to tackle stigma first. So once you tackle stigma and there becomes more of an open culture, and more people feel more willing to, like, attend that webinar and download that app and, look at ways of managing their own mental health and having that education, then the engagement of your initiatives, the money that you're investing will be better utilized, right? So, but we've always done it the opposite way. It's like we'll throw loads of flashy objects at them and just hope that they engage with them, but without tackling the core problem, which is there's still a stigma in the business. Culture isn't there. No one's got an education of why they need to use it. So we always focus on that first. How do you tackle stigma and change culture? Now, there's many ways of doing that. And the reason why people avoid it is because it takes a huge amount of time and it's very specific. But there's one way that we see to be so incredibly powerful that lots of people are now trying, but there's some mistakes that they're making in it. And that is what me and you do, which is getting champions, getting senior leaders, getting people in the business to champion it. And what that simply means is, can you get a colleague on a panel with someone else, facilitated by someone, to talk a little bit about a time when they had to be resilient, or talk about some of the challenges that they've experienced? Like you've said, the shift that happened in an organization, if you get a senior leader talk openly about mental health, is massive, because then all of a sudden it creates this culture where it's more accepting to be like that. A really simple example is, we have people attending our webinars, and managers are saying to them, like, here's a webinar you want to go on. Now, if the question to that manager is like, are you attending that webinar? And they say no, straight away, like, I don't feel comfortable joining that webinar, because I'm like, well, I've got to make sure that I'm, like, being seen as performing and working. And, like, if you're not taking the time out for it, then I'm not going to either as well. So with that, I think one of the key things that we've worked on, and we've just launched an actual initiative on it as well. We've been doing it for a while, but we're really going to focus on it a lot more, is empowering, motivating and supporting champions in organizations. In other words, you and I can go in and share our story. We do it a lot. We'll have an impact. But having someone that you work with, one of your fellow colleagues, do it, creates a completely different shift. But here's some of the mistakes that people make with it. And you've experienced it. I've experienced it in the work that we do. Number one, organizations are training mental health first aiders and champions to do this. But, like, what's the support you're providing to that core group of people, right? So one thing that we're doing is we're creating and offering supervision sessions to those core group of individuals, those mental health first aiders, those champions, supervision sessions that would be the same way that if you're a counselor, you have supervision sessions, because these are heavy stuff that you're dealing with. Lots of businesses are like, well, we've got these mental health first aiders out there having difficult conversations now, but it's like, okay, but what support are you giving them? Because as you've just highlighted, it's one thing sharing your story. Vulnerability creates vulnerability. You're going to have stories coming back. If you're not trained or equipped or have an outlet of you being able to sort of talk about that, that's going to make it more challenging. So we're wrapping that up around a new platform that we've developed, which is a anonymous way of those champions, those mental health first aiders, anonymously logging conversations. So that then feeds back to the organization, to the business, and it will highlight the types of intervention that's happened, the types of, is it financial, is it cost of living, is it, work related? And then we can also dive into that data location focused as well. So let's say Starbucks as an example, if they were to take it on, you'd be able to look at data in like Liverpool and Glasgow, like based upon these core group of individuals that are driving it. So that's one thing that I would say. But yeah, start small. Just have one or two or three of your colleagues, just if they feel comfortable, share something. It's incredible the impact that has.
Agreed. And if I was to reframe the question as what would be the low-hanging fruit for individuals to consider on a day-to-day basis, how different would your answer be? Out with corporates, that is. Just anyone listening, everyone from any walk of life, corporate or whatever job, what are the low-hanging fruits that we still get wrong in society today?
Prioritization of your own self. So I just think that we don't prioritize ourselves enough. It's just, I talk about it a lot. We've never been taught to, right? It's just, I go for my half an hour run in the morning. I feel so guilty and selfish for doing it because I should be spending time with my kids. My wife's giving me the look because, she's got the baby. But why do you feel guilty and selfish when someone dies by suicide every 40 seconds and suicide's the biggest killer of men under 45? Like I always say, as a man of under 45, the biggest threat to me is me. Like it's my own mind, but I still feel guilty and selfish for focusing on myself. And it's funny, I always ask this question in my talks, like, what's the main reason why you couldn't spend 30 minutes in your day on your self-care, whatever, every day? And you know what it is: time, other responsibilities, workload. But underneath all of those excuses is a statement that's like, I don't prioritize myself enough. Because as soon as you prioritize yourself, you find the time. You prioritize yourself over work. You prioritize yourself over other stuff that you're putting in front of your own self. So I think, personally, we just need to do a better job at rewarding people that set boundaries and do stuff that they enjoy and not make them feel guilty for doing it.
And to paint a harsh reality, I'd rather miss you for 30 minutes every morning than miss you forever, which is the big consideration. So fantastic point to finish on, I think. And last thing for me is, where can people find you and where can people dive a little bit deeper into Everymind at Work?
Yeah, cool. So, find me on socials, search for Paul McGregor, should be able to find me, and everymindatwork.com. And we have a free champion course. It's a 1-hour course that anyone can go through to help them support their own mental health and support others in the workplace, outside of the workplace. So you'll be able to find that at everymindatwork.com as well.
And all of that will be in the show notes for people to get involved with. So, Paul, thank you very much. Really enjoyed that conversation. Loads of things I can take away personally, and I know for certain people listening will do the same.
I likewise appreciate the work that you do, Fergus.